A bronze heel rests in the dust of a road, and nothing on that road moves. Steam drifts above a full bath in a stone room, and a net lies on the rim. A rotten ship leans on an empty beach, and an old man sleeps in its shadow. A shirt settles onto a man's shoulders at an altar, and the cloth begins to smoke. A cliff drops into gray water, and one line of footprints ends at the edge. 9 of the greatest heroes of Greece died in those places, and no monster killed them. Every man on this list beat the thing that was supposed to end him. Perseus faced the gorgon, and Bellerophon faced the chimera, and both of them walked away. Heracles cleared the world of horrors, and the world found another way to finish him. Monsters were the easy part of a Greek hero's life, and the myths say so plainly. What killed these men arrived later, and it arrived wearing faces they knew well. A wife waited in a doorway, a son waited on a beach, a friend carried a torch. A beam fell in the dark, a shirt caught fire, a hand pressed against an old back. One man on this list was loved by the gods more than any mortal before him. Zeus called him son, Olympus opened its gates for him, and the poets never stopped. He died worse than every other name here, and his name stays closed until the end. This countdown runs backward from 9 to 1, from the kindest death to the worst one. Number 9 on this list is Perseus, and he almost walked out of the story alive. An old king sits on a stone throne in Tiryns, and his hands rest on carved lions. His crown lies on a table beside him, and nobody in the hall reaches for it. A door opens at the far end of the room, and a younger man steps through it. Guards stand along the wall, and not one of them moves toward the throne. 60 years earlier, a wooden chest floated on open water off the coast of Seriphus. A fisherman dragged it onto the sand, opened the lid, and found a woman and a baby. The woman was Danae, locked in a bronze room by her father to stop a prophecy. The prophecy said her son would kill him, and the sea had just delivered that son. That boy grew, and a king sent him after the head of a gorgon to be rid of him. He came back holding it, and the king who sent him never left his own hall again. A princess chained to a rock on the Ethiopian coast became his wife that same season. On a hill of gray stone, he built a city called Mycenae, and it lasted. Every hero on this list causes one death before his own, and this one is his. Years after Mycenae, Perseus traveled north to Larissa for funeral games held for a stranger. He threw a discus across the open field, and the throw went wide into the crowd. An old man in the front row went down, and the game stopped exactly where they stood. That old man was Achilles, the grandfather who had shut him inside the chest. Perseus had never met him, never hunted him, and had never once planned any of it. The prophecy arrived anyway, carried by a stone disc thrown by a man aiming at nothing. He buried Achilles outside the walls of Larissa and refused the throne of Argos afterward. A king who takes a crown from a man he killed sleeps badly, and he knew that. So he traded Argos to his cousin Megapenthes and took the smaller kingdom of Tiryns instead. Hold on to that trade, because it is the reason a man walks through his door. What comes next is the part almost nobody tells, since it is decades of nothing dramatic. Perseus ruled Tiryns for years, and the great walls of that citadel rose under him. Andromeda stayed with him, which is rare here because most marriages on this list end badly. They had 6 sons and a daughter, and those sons took cities across the whole peninsula. One branch of that family ran forward 3 generations and produced the man at number 1. Perseus is the great-grandfather of the hero whose name is still hidden in this video. The Gorgon head went into a temple, and the winged sandals went back to the gods. His famous years ended before he turned 40, and he lived a long time afterward. Gray came into Andromeda's hair beside him, and the two of them ate the same meals for decades. He watched his own legend harden into a story told about him rather than by him. Children in Tiryns knew the Gorgon by heart, the way children know a song. The man who lived it sat in the same hall each morning and heard it told wrong. He stopped correcting them, which is how a living man becomes a statue while still breathing. Across the plain in Argos, Megapenthes ruled the kingdom Perseus had handed over to him. Megapenthes was the son of Proetus, and Proetus had died in a quarrel over Argos. One tradition says Perseus turned that father to stone during the worst hour of that quarrel. A son who inherits a kingdom from his father's killer inherits something heavier along with it. Nothing happened for years, and that is the detail people always get wrong about revenge. Revenge in these stories is patient, and it usually arrives with gray in its own hair. One tradition says Megapenthes came to Tiryns and killed the old king inside his hall. The hall was quiet, the guards were old, and the doors of Tiryns opened for family. There is no monster in that room, no prophecy, and no god watching from a cloud. There is a middle-aged man, an older man, and a debt roughly 40 years old. Other versions say nothing at all, and Perseus simply stops appearing in the story. That silence is its own kind of ending, and for a Greek hero, it is a kind one. Centuries later, travelers on the road between Mycenae and Argos passed a small shrine. Pausanias saw it and wrote it down, a hero shrine to Perseus, standing beside that road. Local people still brought him offerings, which is more than most of this list ever received. Islanders on Seriphos remembered him, and kings across the plain claimed his blood in their line. He has a grave, he has a cult, and he has descendants sitting on real thrones. Look at that list again, because every item on it belongs to a normal, successful life. He killed the monster, married the woman, built the city, raised the sons, ruled the land. He grew old inside his own walls with his wife and his grandchildren nearby. Even the version where a rival kills him gives him 50 full years first. Greeks looked at that and called it a happy ending, and they were not being ironic. A happy ending in Greece meant dying old, at home, remembered, with a grave people tend. Perseus is the only man in this countdown who receives all four of those things. Nobody else on this list dies at home, and nobody else here grows old in comfort. From here the list only goes downward, and it goes down quickly and very far. That is the sentence worth holding before the next name arrives. Number 9 died full of years, and the 8 men left died full of something else. The next man died quickly, and speed was the only mercy anyone showed him. An arrow found him in the open, and the whole thing took less than a breath. He is also the only man here who chose his own death long in advance. He was offered a long, quiet life in a green country far from any war. He turned it down while he was still young, and he never asked for it back. Number 8 on this list is Achilles, and he is the only volunteer in this countdown. Dust hangs in the air below the Scaean gates, and the road under the wall is empty. A shield lies flat in that dust, and the arm that carried it is nowhere in the picture. On the stones of the wall, a long shadow stretches out, then folds down and stops moving. Men above the gates are shouting, and men on the plain are running toward one spot. Years before that shadow fell, a boy sat in a hall in the green hills of Phthia. His mother came in from the sea, sat down beside him, and told him the truth. Thetis was a goddess, and goddesses in these stories know exactly how their children end. She laid 2 lives on the table in front of him, and let him take one. The first life was long and quiet, spent in Phthia, with grandchildren and a soft death indoors. Nobody would sing about it, and nobody outside that valley would ever learn his name. The second life ended young, on a foreign beach, under a wall he would never climb. In exchange, the world would say his name for 3,000 years without once stopping. He was still a boy when he chose, and he took the second one without long argument. Hold that choice, because everything after it is simply the invoice arriving in installments. He sailed east with 50 ships and became the best fighter in a war of great fighters. Cities along that coast fell to him one after another while the siege of Troy dragged. Trojan men stopped walking out of their gates once they saw his armor on the plain. Greek kings who could not stand him still built their battle plans around where he stood. Then a quarrel started over a captive woman, and the quarrel was really about respect. Agamemnon took Perseus out of his tent to prove that a high king outranks a hero. Achilles walked down to the shore, called his mother out of the water, and asked for revenge. He asked that his own army lose badly until they came crawling to his tent. Zeus granted it, and Greek men died in rows on the sand because of that argument. Ships burned at the waterline while the best soldier alive sat in his tent and watched. Old men came to him with gifts, with apologies, with lists of cities he could rule. He refused all of it, because the insult was never really about the woman or the gold. Patroclus came to him crying, asked for the armor, and asked to go out wearing it. Achilles said yes, set a limit on how far he could go, and the limit was ignored. Hector met Patroclus near the wall, and the armor came back to camp on a stretcher. That is the moment the deal closed, because grief did what pride had refused to do. He went back into the war for a dead friend, rather than for a living cause. He drove the Trojan army across the plain, and choked a river with their retreat. Hector waited outside the gates alone, then ran, and the chase went 3 times around the city. The duel itself lasted moments, and the man who had held Troy for 10 years fell. Behind a chariot, the body went round the walls for days, while the whole city watched. Before that, Hector spoke one sentence that reads now like a verdict read in court. He told Achilles that Paris and Apollo would kill him at those same Scaean gates. Achilles told him to die and stop talking, which is the answer of a man on schedule. Both of them knew the prophecy was real, and only one of them was disturbed by it. An old king came to that tent at night and kissed the hands that killed his son. Achilles gave the body back, shared a meal with the enemy, and slept afterward. That night is the last calm scene anyone ever wrote for him, and it lasts one evening. War started again in the morning, and 2 more champions arrived at Troy to stop him. An Amazon queen came first, and he beat her, and then the helmet came off her face. One tradition says he stood over her for a long time and grieved for what he had done. A son of the dawn came next, in bronze from another continent, and he beat him too. Nothing left standing on that plain could take him, and that is when the gods moved. Apollo had reasons of his own, and gods in these stories keep very long accounts. Achilles pushed the Trojans back against the wall and came under the Scaean gates. Paris stood on the tower above with a bow, a man who always fought at a distance. An arrow left that bow, and something invisible corrected its line while it was still flying. Sound drops out on the wall, the shouting stops, and the shield hits the road. The best soldier of the age was finished by the worst soldier in that war. Homer never mentions a heel, and the oldest account simply gives Paris and Apollo the credit. One tradition says his mother had dipped him in a dark river and held him by 1 foot. That version turns up centuries later and hands the story a target it never actually needed. Either way, the outcome holds, because a tower, a coward, and a god closed the account. 2 men carried him out of the fighting, while the Trojans came for the body. One of them held the line alone all afternoon, and his name returns later in this countdown. Greek soldiers washed him, laid him out on the shore, and mourned him for 17 days. On the 18th day they lit the fire, and the smoke was visible from the city. His bones went into a golden jar, mixed with the bones of Patroclus, as he had asked. Sailors passing that coast for centuries saw his mound on the headland from open water. A Macedonian king stood at that mound and envied a dead man for having a poet. So was he cheated? Or did he receive exactly what he ordered at that table in Phthia? He was told the price in advance, in plain words, by someone who could not lie to him. Nobody tricked him, no monster took him, and no god broke a promise made to him. He signed for a short life and total fame, and both halves arrived on time. He is the only man in this countdown who died still holding what he traded for. That is why he sits at number 8 instead of lower, because the exchange was honest. Achilles died young, in armor, in front of an army that never stopped saying his name. The next man on this list lost his glory while he was still alive to watch it leave. He ruled a great city, and that city turned on him and watched him walk to the gates. He died as an old guest on somebody else's island, and nobody marked the place. Number 7 on this list is Theseus, and he is the first man here to lose everything twice. Wind moves across a bare clifftop on a small island in the middle of the Aegean. An old man in a plain cloak stands near the edge with his back to the path. Another man walks up behind him, close enough to touch him, and says something short. Below them the sea works against black rock, and nothing on that rock is soft. Long before that island, a young man walked up the road to Athens with a sword. He came into a city that did not know him and left it as its heir. He sailed to Crete with 14 children chosen by lottery to be handed to a monster. He came out of that labyrinth alive with a thread in his hand and the children behind him. On the way home, he forgot to change the black sail on the mast for a white one. His father watched that black sail come in from a high rock above the water. The old king went off that rock into the sea, and the sea took his name. So the reign of Theseus opened with a father falling from a height, which matters later. In Athens, he did the thing that actually made him great, and it was paperwork. Attica was a scatter of villages that quarreled, and he pulled them into one city. He gave up part of his own power to do it, and set up a council to hold the rest. Athenians called him the founder of their democracy for that, centuries after he was dust. A man who beats a monster gets a song, and a man who unites a country gets a state. He had both by middle age, and then the second half of his life started. His household came apart first, in the way these families always come apart. A wife, a stepson, an accusation that was false, and a curse spoken in anger by the father. Hippolytus died on a coast road, and the truth arrived a few hours too late. Theseus buried a son he had killed with his own mouth, and the palace went quiet. Grief made him reckless, and reckless men in these stories go looking for company. He found it in Pirithous, a friend who was always ready with a worse idea. Together they took a girl out of Sparta who was far too young to be taken. Her brothers came north with an army, and Athens paid for that trip in burned fields. Then the two friends went down to the underworld to steal the queen of the dead. Hades offered them seats, they sat, and the stone held on to both of them. Theseus stayed in that chair long enough for the world above to move on without him. Heracles pulled him off it years later, on his way through on other business. The friend stayed behind, and one tradition says he is sitting there still. So a gray-haired king came back up into daylight and walked home to his own city. Athens had a new leader named Menestheus and a public that liked him better. The city he had gathered into one now listened to Menestheus and not to him. He spoke in the marketplace, and the crowd that once cheered him quietly turned away. There is no fight in this part, no siege, no last stand at the gate. A crowd simply looked at an old hero and decided he belonged to the past. He cursed the city on his way out, which is what men do when the room is gone. Then he took a ship east towards Skyros, a rocky island where his family owned land. He went there to collect an inheritance, meaning he went there to ask for money. King Lycomedes met him at the harbor and welcomed him with everything a guest expects: food, a bed, wine, warm words, and the sworn protection every Greek host owes a guest. That protection was the strongest rule these people had, older than kings and backed by Zeus. Lycomedes also knew that a famous exile on a small island is a problem with legs. Athens might want him back, or Skyros might wake up one morning under his flag. So the king suggested a walk, because his guest should see the whole property. They climbed together, two men talking, one of them pointing out fields and boundaries. The path narrowed near the top and ran along the edge above open water. Plutarch says the host pushed him off the cliff and told the island he had slipped. There is nothing to show in that moment except a path, wind, and one man walking back down. Nobody in Athens came to ask questions, and nobody on Skyros wanted to raise them. The man who mapped the labyrinth died on a clear day on an open hillside. He survived a monster in a maze, an underworld, and a war with Sparta over one girl. What finished him was a friendly conversation with the owner of the house where he slept. His father had fallen from a rock into the sea because of a sail nobody changed. The son fell from a rock into the sea because of a host nobody suspected. That grave stayed unmarked for generations while Athens grew rich on the state he had built. Then, men fighting at Marathon swore they saw a huge warrior in old armor ahead of them. The oracle at Delphi told Athens to go find their founder and bring him home. A general named Cimon took ships to Skyros and dug across the island looking for bones. Plutarch says an eagle scratched at a mound, and under that mound lay a tall skeleton. Beside it lay a bronze spearhead and a sword, which was enough proof for a hungry city. The bones came into Athens on a warship through a crowd that had never seen him. They built him a temple in the center of the city that had turned him out. Every exile, every runaway, and every beaten slave could claim protection inside those walls. That is a strange apology to accept, arriving several hundred years after the funeral. Ask what he actually gets in the final accounting of this list. He gets a temple, a festival, and a grave that was empty for most of history. He does not get a death anyone can point to, a witness, or a single day of justice. Number 9 died old at home, and number 8 died young in his armor. Number 7 died as somebody's guest, and lay in unmarked ground for centuries. He trusted the oldest rule his world had, and the rule turned out to be a courtesy. A stranger with a small kingdom removed the founder of Athens on a walk after lunch. The next man on this list also died on a beach, also as an old king, also caught unprepared. His killer was not a stranger, and that is the whole problem with the story. The hand that finished him belonged to his own blood, walking toward him in the dark. Neither of them knew the other's face, and both of them found out too late. Number 6 on this list is Odysseus, and his death is the one almost nobody has heard. Gray light sits on a stony beach on Ithaca, and cattle are moving somewhere behind the trees. An old man in a farmer's cloak stands on the shingle with a spear held low. A young stranger faces him with another spear, and the point of it is not bronze. It is pale, thin, and slightly curved, the kind of thing a fisherman pulls from a stingray. Rain starts, the two of them close, and only one of them is still standing afterward. That young man drops his weapon and looks down at his own hands for a long moment. 20 years earlier, this beach was empty, and everyone on the island thought he was dead. He had gone east to Troy with 12 ships and given the war its ending. 10 years of siege broke on one idea of his, a hollow horse and a quiet night. Then the sea kept him for another 10, and he lost every ship and every man. He came home alone, cleaned out the men eating his house, and took back his wife and his bed. That is where the famous poem stops, and the story itself does not stop there. Halfway through those wandering years, he had gone down to the edge of the dead. He dug a trench in gray ground and called up a blind prophet to ask about home. Tiresias told him about the cattle of the sun, about the suitors, and about one last journey. After Ithaca, he was to take an oar on his shoulder and walk inland, away from water. He was to keep walking until he met people who had never seen salt in their lives. When a stranger looked at the oar and called it a tool for winnowing grain, he could stop. There he was to plant the oar and make sacrifice, and only then go home. Then the prophet said the line that has confused readers for nearly 3,000 years. Death would come to him from the sea, gentle, when he was rich in years and comfortable. The Greek behind that phrase can mean out of the sea or away from it entirely. Odysseus was the cleverest man of his generation, and he read it the comfortable way. He heard a promise of a quiet ending in a warm room, far from ships and salt. He did not hear a description of the weapon that was going to be used on him. So he did the inland walk, planted the oar, came home, and settled into farming. Penelope grew older beside him, Telemachus took on more of the estate, and the years passed. He hunted, judged disputes, drank with neighbors, and told the Troy stories to anyone new. The most traveled man in Greece spent his last decades inside one small rocky island. Meanwhile, on an island he had left long before, a boy was growing up asking questions. Circe had borne a son to him, and the son was called Telegonus. His mother told him the truth about his father, since goddesses in these stories always do. She also told him where the man lived, which turned out to be the dangerous part. Telegonus wanted a father, and a young man with a boat can turn wanting into sailing. Circe gave him a spear before he went, tipped with the spine of a ray from her own waters. She was a witch, the tip was poisoned, and she meant it to keep her son safe. A weapon made by a mother to protect her boy is about to become the point of this story. He sailed for Ithaca and missed it, which is exactly what his father used to do. Storms put him on a coast he did not recognize, and his crew had eaten nothing for days. So they did what hungry raiders always did, and started driving cattle down to the shore. Word reached the old king that armed strangers were stealing his herds in the rain. He came down to the beach with his son and a spear, because that is what a king does. Two men who had never met stood in bad light, and each saw an enemy in the way. Nobody on that beach said a name, and neither of them thought to ask for one. The fight was short, and the poisoned point went through an old man's guard. The rain keeps falling, the cattle keep moving, and the young man kneels on the stones. Somebody says a name out loud, and then somebody else repeats it as a question. Telegonus finds out who he has killed while he is still holding the spear that did it. This is the part the story is really about, because the wound is over quickly. There is a man on his knees on a beach with a father he met 11 seconds ago. Odysseus lived long enough to learn where the young man came from and who sent him. One tradition says the two of them spoke, and that the old king forgave him for it. The cleverest man in Greece spent his last minutes solving a riddle he had misread for decades. Death did come out of the sea, in a boat, carrying a spine from the seabed. It came in old age, at home, in wealth, exactly as promised, and none of that helped. He had heard the words as a soft ending, and they were a set of directions. The aftermath is stranger than the death, and is almost never told to anyone. Telegonus took the body, took Penelope, and took Telemachus back to his mother's island. Circe made all three of them ageless, which is a very odd apology from a family. Then Telegonus married Penelope, and Telemachus married Circe, and the two houses joined. A son who killed his father married the widow, and the story treats that as a resolution. That is how the last epic of the Trojan cycle ends, and Greek audiences accepted it. Compare that to the three men already behind him on this countdown. Perseus went out among grandchildren, and Achilles went out under an army watching him. Theseus went off a cliff with nobody around and lay in unmarked ground for centuries. Odysseus gets a funeral, a wife who mourned him, two sons standing over the same body. He also gets the specific pain of understanding the mistake while there is still time to speak. Every other death on this list is an ambush, and his is a translation error. The gods never lied to him once, and that is somehow worse than being lied to. They told him the truth in a form he was certain to hear the wrong way. He survived the sea for 20 years, and it walked up onto his beach as a boy. Number 6 ends with 2 women, 2 sons, and a body that people argued over lovingly. The next man on this list was not carried anywhere by anybody at all. Nobody argued over him, nobody sailed for him, and nobody wrote down where he lay. He died alone, under a piece of wood, on a beach, with no witnesses whatsoever. The only thing standing over him at the end was the thing that made him famous. Number 5 on this list is Jason, and he is the only man here killed by his own achievement. A ship sits high on a beach at Corinth, with weeds growing through the timbers. Salt has eaten the hull, the paint is gone, and gulls stand along the broken rail. An old man sleeps in the shade underneath it, with a folded cloak under his head. High above him, one curved beam shifts a finger's width, and dust falls from the joint. Nobody is walking on that beach, and the sea is a long way down the sand. 40 years earlier, this same wood was the most famous object in the Greek world. A young man had come into a court in Thessaly wearing one sandal and asking for his throne. His uncle sent him east instead, after a golden fleece, expecting the sea to solve the problem. He gathered the best men alive on one deck and took them through water nobody had crossed. He came back with the fleece and with a foreign princess who had made it possible. Medea gave him the fleece, and she paid for it by destroying her own family to leave. She killed for him on the way out, and killed for him again once they reached Greece. Every impossible thing on that voyage was solved by her hands, and both of them knew it. They settled in Corinth, had 2 sons, and lived there for roughly 10 quiet years. Then the king of Corinth offered his daughter, and a throne came attached to the offer. Jason took the offer and explained to Medea that this was practical planning for the children. He had sworn an oath to her in Colchis in a cave in front of gods who listen. In Euripides, he stands in the courtyard and argues that the oath was a technicality. Medea listened to that speech, went inside, and made her own decision about his future. The new bride died in the palace, and her father died holding her, and Corinth panicked. Then the sons died too, inside the house, and the plague keeps that behind the door. Jason came running through the gate and found the courtyard empty and the doors locked. Medea appeared above the roof in a chariot pulled by serpents, out of his reach forever. He asked to touch the bodies, and she refused him even that, and then she was gone. Euripides ends the play there, and everything after it belongs to the other sources. Understand what he actually is on the morning after, because it explains the next 30 years. He is a man with no wife, no children, no throne in Corinth, and no throne at home. He is also an oath breaker, and in that world, the word carries weight we no longer feel. Zeus was the god of oaths and the god of guests, and both had been insulted in his house. Men who broke a promise sworn on gods were assumed to carry bad luck like a smell. Doors that had opened for the captain of the Argo opened a little less each year. He went to Iolcus and found the throne taken and the city uninterested in old claims. Cities along the coast remembered him, fed him once, listened to the story, and moved on. Some told the version where Medea did it, and some told the version where he earned it. He aged into a story other people told at dinner while he sat further down the table. The men who had sailed with him were dying off, and the survivors had their own kingdoms. Heracles was busy, Orpheus was gone, and the twins had been made into stars. A crew of 50 legends had scattered into 50 separate endings, and his was still running. So he came back to the only object in the world that still had his name on it. The Argo had been dragged onto the beach at Corinth and dedicated to a god. Nobody sailed her anymore, and nobody maintained her, because dedicated things belonged to the temple. 20 seasons of sun and salt had opened the seams and rotted the frames from inside. Weeds came up through the deckboards and birds nested in the hollow of the hull. He started sleeping under her, in the shade, which is the detail the sources agree on. One tradition says the prow of that ship had been cut from the speaking oak of Dodona. Priests at Dodona listened to that grove and read the future in how the leaves moved. Athena was said to have set a piece of it into the ship so the Argo could talk. During the voyage, that beam warned the crew, gave directions, and refused to let them pass unclean. A ship that could speak is the strangest thing in the whole legend, and it made him famous. Now the same beam is gray wood over a sleeping man on an empty beach. Nothing warns him, because the god who spoke through that oak stopped speaking a long time ago. The joint gives, and one timber comes down out of the shade onto the shape below. Gulls lift off the rail all at once and settle again a moment later. There is no crowd on that beach, no witness, no funeral, and no grave anyone recorded. The most famous ship in the world killed the most famous captain in the world, quietly. Sit with the shape of that ending, because it is more precise than it first looks. The Argo did not fall on a stranger, and it did not fall while anyone was working on it. It fell on the one man who had nothing else left to sleep beside. Everything he ever had came off that deck, and everything he lost came from what he did next. He traded the woman who built his success for a marriage that lasted a single evening. He kept the ship and lost the crew, kept the fame and lost the household. The last thing he built was the last thing standing over him, and it took 30 years. Then it finished the job in 1 second while he was asleep and not thinking about it. Number 6 died talking to his son on a beach, with people running toward him. Number 5 died under a plank, with nobody within shouting distance of the water. That is the difference, and it is the reason he sits one place higher on this list. A death with no witness is not more painful, but it is much harder to survive as a story. The next death on this list had witnesses, a full household, and a locked bathroom door. It also had sound, and the sound is the reason we still know exactly how it went. The greatest playwright in Greece put that noise on a stage in front of thousands. He made an audience stand in a courtyard and listen to a king call out from inside. Number 4 on this list is Agamemnon, and he is the first man here killed on a schedule. Steam rises off hot water in a small stone room with a low ceiling in Argos. Clothes lie folded on a bench, and a pair of muddy traveling boots stands by the door. A woman waits in the corridor outside, holding a length of heavy woven cloth over one arm. Behind her, leaning against the wall where the light does not reach, an axe stands upright. She has been holding that cloth for 10 years, and the water has been warm since dawn. 10 years earlier, 1,000 ships sat on a beach in Aulis and could not leave. The wind blew the wrong way for weeks, and an army of bored men began to rot. Priests said the goddess wanted payment and named the price out loud in front of the kings. The commander was to bring his eldest daughter to Aulis and put her on an altar. He sent home a message saying the girl was to be married to Achilles and should come quickly. Clytemnestra dressed her for that wedding and sent her east with the household in good spirits. Iphigenia walked up to the altar in front of the whole fleet and understood at the last moment. The wind changed that afternoon, the ships left, and the mother in Argos received a report. Everything in this chapter runs off that one decision, and nothing else really matters. He got his war, and his war took 10 years and returned him almost nothing. He fought with Achilles over a captive and lost half his army, proving a point about rank. He watched the best men in Greece die in front of a wall he could not break. Then another man's idea got him inside, and Troy burned, and he came home rich. He came back with a fleet full of gold, slaves, and a Trojan princess named Cassandra. Apollo had given Cassandra perfect sight of the future, and then removed her credibility entirely. She could see every room in Argos before the ship reached the harbor, and nobody would listen. In Aeschylus, she stands in the chariot outside the gate and refuses to go inside. She smells old blood in that house, describes children on a plate, and names the trap. The chorus of old men hears every word, agrees she sounds terrible, and does nothing at all. Then she walks in anyway, because a woman who knows the future also knows there is no exit. Meanwhile, Clytemnestra had spent 10 years running a kingdom and building a case. She took Aegisthus into the palace, a cousin with his own inherited reason to want that house gone. She managed the estate, the harvests, the guards, and the story the city told about her. She also kept a signal fire chain running across the islands so she would know the day. Troy fell in the night, and the news crossed the sea on hilltops before any sail appeared. So the household had hours of warning, and the bath was drawn while he was still on the road. He came through the gate expecting the welcome that a conquering king considers normal. She met him in the courtyard and gave a speech about a wife's 10 lonely years. Then she had servants roll a length of purple cloth from the chariot to the door. That color cost a fortune and was normally spread only for a god entering a temple. He objected, said it was too much, said the gods dislike a mortal who takes divine honors. She argued with him in public until he took off his boots and walked on it anyway. Every Greek in that theater understood exactly what had just happened in that exchange. She had put him one step above where a man is allowed to stand, in front of witnesses. He went into the house across the purple, and the doors closed behind him. Inside, the water was ready, and the room was small, and his armor was already off. She came in with the cloth over her arm and offered it to him as a towel. He let her put it over him, because a wife has helped a husband dress for 30 years. That cloth had no opening for the head and no opening for the arms anywhere in it. In Aeschylus, it is called a net, and the play calls it a net for fish more than once. The commander of 1,000 ships was tangled in wet wool in a room with one door. Outside, the old men of the chorus are standing in the courtyard talking about the war. Then a voice comes through the wall, one shout, and every man on stage stops moving. They ask each other what that was, and the voice comes a second time, weaker. Aeschylus keeps the whole thing off stage, and gives the audience nothing but sound and old men. They debate whether to go in, propose it, discuss it, and reach no decision at all. That debate is the cruelest scene in Greek theater because a king dies during a committee meeting. The doors open, and Clytemnestra is standing there with the cloth, and she is completely calm. She does not deny it, apologize for it, or claim a god pushed her hand. She tells the city she killed him for Iphigenia and calls it justice done in the proper amount. Cassandra had gone in first and never came back out, and the plague grants her no rescue. Two people who saw the future clearly both died inside that house on the same afternoon. Now weigh this against the four men behind him in the countdown. Perseus grew old, Achilles chose it, Theseus trusted a host, and Jason slept under a plank. Agamemnon walked into a room where every object had been placed by somebody who loved him once. The water, the cloth, the purple, the hour of arrival, all of it was arranged in advance. He also carried the actual reason with him from Aulis and never once counted it as debt. He killed a daughter for a wind and expected to come home to the family he left. The man who took Troy could not survive his own bathroom, and the doors were not even locked. His son avenged him later and paid for that too, and the whole house kept burning for generations. What sits under this death is a woman with a reason that a Greek audience could follow. They could argue about whether she was right, and they did argue, for centuries. The next man on this list had no one to blame, and no revenge to leave behind. Nobody plotted against him, nobody drew a bath, and no god arranged a homecoming for him. He did it himself, at dawn, in an empty field, with a weapon a friend had given him. Understanding a wife with an axe is easy compared to understanding that morning. Number 3 on this list is Ajax, and his death is the only one here that shames everyone present. Dawn light comes across a field behind the Greek camp, where the grass is flattened and torn. Sheep and cattle lie scattered across it in a wide arc reaching almost to the tree line. Ropes trail from some of them, and a broken pen stands open at the far end. In the center of that field, one sword stands upright, with its hilt pressed into the soil. A woman comes over the rise with a cloak in her arms, and stops when she sees it. 9 years earlier, this man was the largest thing standing on the plain of Troy. Greeks called him the wall of the army, and the phrase was not decoration. He carried a shield like a tower, 7 layers of oxhide with bronze over the front. When the Trojans reached the ships with fire, he stood on the decks alone and held them. He fought Hector to a draw in single combat, while both armies sat down to watch. Only one man in that army was better, and everyone, including Ajax, agreed on the name. Then that better man died under the wall, and the fighting over his body lasted hours. Ajax carried Achilles out of the crowd on his shoulders, while another man covered the retreat. He walked back into camp with the best soldier in the world dead across his back. Then the Greeks had to decide who inherited the armor that Hephaestus had made. It was divine work, and the only prize in that war worth arguing about seriously. Ajax expected it, because he had physically brought the man home through an enemy army. Odysseus claimed it too, and he claimed it with an argument rather than a shoulder. The kings ran a hearing, listened to both cases, and voted for the man with the better speech. One tradition says they let captured Trojans decide which Greek had frightened them most. Either way, the armor went to Odysseus, and the whole camp watched the announcement. Nothing in his life had prepared him for losing something by talking. He was second only to Achilles for 10 years and never once complained about the ranking. The moment the ranking became a matter of opinion, the ground under him disappeared. He went to his tent, and that night he decided the kings had cheated him deliberately. He took his sword and went out to find Agamemnon, Menelaus, and Odysseus in the dark. Athena stepped in, and what she does to him is worse than anything she could have done. She did not stop him or strike him down or take his strength away for a season. She left him walking, armed, and completely certain, and she moved the pictures in his eyes. He crossed the camp, opened the animal pens, and worked through the herds until morning. He tied living beasts to posts, and stood over them making speeches to men who were not there. Sophocles keeps all of it off stage and gives the audience only the sounds and the aftermath. Odysseus arrives at the tent at dawn, and Athena walks him through what happened like a guide. She is amused by it, and that amusement is the cruelest sound in the play. Then the light comes up and the vision lifts, and he is standing in a field of livestock. Everything he did that night is lying around him in the open, where the whole army can see. Men are already coming over the ridge to look, and some of them are laughing. Understand what shame meant to a man of that culture, because our word is much smaller. His entire worth was public, measured in what other men said about him out loud. He had no private self to fall back on, no inner life that could survive the camp's opinion. He had been the wall of the army, and by breakfast, he was the story soldiers told at the fire. Tecmessa, the woman who shared his tent, begs him in front of their small son. She tells him she has no family left anywhere, and that the boy has only him. He calls the boy over, holds him up, and hopes aloud that he grows up luckier. Then he gives a long, calm speech about letting go of anger and yielding to the gods. Everyone in the play believes him, and the chorus starts singing about relief. That speech is a lie told kindly, and the audience understands it before the characters do. He walks out to the shore alone, to a strip of ground behind the camp near some trees. The weapon he takes is the sword Hector gave him after their duel years before. The two of them had fought all day and then exchanged gifts because neither could win. Hector gave him that sword, and Ajax gave Hector a belt, and both gifts ended badly. He speaks to it, to the sun, to Salamis, and to the water, and then the stage empties. There is nothing to show after that except a field, a sword upright, and a woman running. What follows is the part that makes this the third worst death on the list. The kings arrive and forbid the burial, and they forbid it loudly, in front of the body. Menelaus calls him a traitor who tried to murder his own commanders in the night. Agamemnon agrees and orders him left where he lies for the birds and the dogs. His brother Teucer stands over him alone and refuses to move for either king. For a Greek, a body left unburied was not an insult but a permanent sentence. The soul could not be received anywhere and simply stood outside for as long as the world lasted. So the greatest defensive fighter of the war was about to be erased on procedural grounds. The man who saves him is Odysseus, the man who took the armor and caused all of it. He tells Agamemnon that a great enemy is still a great man and deserves the ground. The kings give way, Teucer digs, and the play ends with a funeral nobody wanted to allow. Then Homer adds one line that finishes the story for good much later. Odysseus goes down to the dead, and every shade he meets comes forward to speak with him. Ajax stands apart at the edge of the dark, and will not come near or answer him. Odysseus calls to him twice, apologizes, blames the gods for the armor, and gets nothing. The tallest man in that place turns and walks back into the shadows without a word. That silence is the last thing anyone ever hears from him in Greek literature. Look at how little it took to end the second strongest man in the world. 10 years of war could not do it, Hector could not do it, and fire on the ships could not do it. One vote went the wrong way, one night went badly, and one morning came up too bright. Perseus grew old, Achilles chose it, Theseus was pushed, Jason was crushed, Agamemnon was ambushed. Ajax is the only man here whose enemy was the opinion of the people beside him. If any part of that morning sounds close to your own life, it is worth saying out loud to someone. Shame lies about how permanent it is, and it lied to the largest man on that beach. The next man on this list would have taken that field gladly, and he never got the option. The gods did not send madness to hide him, and they did not send an ending at all. They took his glory, took his sight, took his legs, and then left him breathing for decades. He walked across an empty plain for years, while every road he came to had people on it. Number 2 on this list is Bellerophon, and he is the only man here the gods refused to kill. A wide, flat plain lies under a white sky somewhere in the middle of Asia Minor. Dry grass runs to the horizon in every direction, with no walls and no smoke anywhere. An old man moves across it slowly, dragging one leg, with a stick in his right hand. Ahead of him, a farm road crosses the plain, and two shepherds are walking along it. He turns and goes wide around them through the grass, and neither of them looks up. He has been doing that for years, and there is nobody left who would recognize his face. Long before that plain, this man had the best story in Greece, and everyone knew it. He came to Argos as a young exile, and the queen decided she wanted him. He refused her, politely, because a guest does not do that to his host. She told her husband the opposite, and the husband sent him east with a sealed letter. That letter asked the king of Lycia to kill the man carrying it, which he read after 9 days of hospitality. So the king solved it by sending him against the chimera, expecting the monster to close the matter. Nothing in Lycia could face that thing, because it was lion at the front and serpent behind, and breathed fire. He went up to a temple, slept there, and Athena left a golden bridle beside him in the night. He took it to a spring outside town, where a winged horse came down to drink. Pegasus had never accepted a rider, and the bridle went on without a fight. Then a man on a flying horse solved the fire-breathing monster from an altitude it could not reach. He came back, and the king sent him against tribes and raiders and a company of Amazons. He beat all of them, survived an ambush of the king's own best men afterward, and came home again. At that point the king stopped trying, showed him the letter, and gave him his daughter. Bellerophon became heir to Lycia with a princess, children, and the only flying horse alive. Homer says the gods loved him, and Homer does not hand that sentence out often. That is the top of the arc, and everything after it happens inside his own head. His son was killed, and one tradition says a daughter died as well, and the house went quiet. A man who has never lost anything handles the first real loss badly. He started asking why, and asking why to the sky is where these stories always turn. He had beaten the chimera, ridden the horse of the gods, and married into a kingdom by merit. So he decided he had earned the right to walk up and ask the question in person. He took Pegasus out one morning and pointed him at the top of the sky. Pindar says he went for Olympus itself, to sit at the table with the ones who own the answers. Zeus watched a mortal climbing toward his hall on a horse that belonged to the gods. He did not throw a bolt, and he did not send a storm, and that choice is the whole point. He sent one insect, a gadfly, which flew down and stung the horse under the tail. Pegasus threw his rider at a height where a man has a long time to think. The fall took him down into a thorn field on the plain below, and the horse went on without him. Pegasus reached Olympus alone, and Zeus kept him there and used him to carry thunder. The man landed in the thorns, and unlike everyone else on this list, he got up. One tradition says he came out of that field blind, and every version leaves him crippled. He could walk badly, and he could think clearly, and he had perhaps 30 years remaining. Now look at what those 30 years actually consisted of, because this is the punishment. He could not go back to Lycia, because a man who insults Zeus infects the house that shelters him. Kings who had feasted him closed their gates rather than take that risk with their own cities. Villages fed him at the edge of the fields and asked him to be somewhere else by morning. Homer names the place he ended up and calls it the Plain of Wandering. He says the man ate his own heart out there, avoiding the paths where people walked. That phrase is 3,000 years old, and there is still no better description of it. Every other man on this list has a moment where the story does something to them. This man has decades of nothing at all happening while he walks the same flat ground. He aged, his hair went, his leg got worse, and the world moved on without any interest. Somewhere in Lycia, his old palace stood, with somebody else's family living in it. Somewhere on Olympus, his horse was working for the god who had knocked him off it. Poets kept telling the chimera story in halls where the man himself was refused a bed. Then one day the walking stopped, on that plain, and no source tells us how. There is no death scene here, and that absence is not an accident of the record. He has no tomb, no hero shrine, no cult, no festival, and no city claiming his bones. Perseus has a shrine on a road, Achilles has a mound sailors could see from the water. Theseus got a temple centuries late, and even Ajax got his grave after the kings argued about it. Bellerophon has a plane, a nickname for a plane, and one line about eating his own heart. Consider what Zeus actually chose in that moment above the clouds. A bolt would have made him a hero destroyed by the gods, and poets would have sung that. A fall would have killed him in the sky at the height of the best story in Greece. Instead, the king of the gods used a fly, which is a comment as much as a weapon. He let the man live, and he made the living the sentence, and he made it last decades. Every other death on this list is an event, and this one is the absence of an event. Number 3 ended in one bright morning that a man could not survive. Number 2 ended in no morning in particular, spread thin across 30 years of grass. He is the only man here who was punished with more time instead of less. There is no wife holding a net, no son with a spear, no beam, no vote, and no arrow. There is a plane, a stick, and a road he keeps stepping off to avoid meeting anybody. So the gods hated this man and refused to let him die, and that was the worst they had. Now hold that thought against the man at number 1, because they loved him. Zeus called him son, Olympus opened for him, and the poets never once stopped singing. Watch what those same gods allowed to be done to the mortal they cared about most. Number 1 on this list is Heracles, and he is the man the promise at the start was about. Zeus called him son in front of the whole council of Olympus and never took it back. Athena walked beside him on the road, Hermes carried his messages, and Apollo answered his questions. No mortal in Greek myth was closer to the gods, and none of them was harder to kill. A linen shirt lies folded in a wooden box on a table in a hall in Trachis. A woman lifts it out, holds it up to the light, and folds it again carefully. Somewhere else a man puts that shirt on his shoulders, while an altar fire burns behind him. The cloth settles against his skin, and a thin line of smoke rises from one shoulder. Everything that follows comes from a river crossing that happened many years before that morning. Start with what he was, because the size of the fall depends on the height. He was the strongest man who ever lived, and the only one built for a specific purpose. Hera hated him from birth, and sent snakes into his cradle before he could walk. He grew up and married a princess of Thebes, and had children with her in a normal house. Then Hera reached into his mind for an afternoon, and left him there alone with his family. What he did in that house is the reason there were 12 labors in the first place. Sophocles and the others keep the scene closed, and the aftermath is a man sitting in wreckage. He went to Delphi and asked how to clean it, and the answer was 12 years of service. So the strongest man alive spent a decade taking orders from a small, frightened king. He killed the lion nothing could cut and wore its skin for the rest of his life. He burned the hydra's neck shut and dipped his arrows in the blood of that creature. Remember those arrows because one of them is the actual murder weapon in this story. He cleaned the stables, took the belt, moved the cattle, and brought back the golden apples. Then he walked down into the country of the dead and came back up with the dog. No other man on this list has a record anywhere near that, and everyone knew it. Cities put his image on their coins while he was still alive and working. Kings paid him, temples claimed his visits, and the road he traveled collected stories behind him. He also had a temper, and the temper cost him twice, and both times he served time for it. He was sold as a slave to a foreign queen for a year to pay off one killing. The strongest man in the world spent that year in her household doing whatever she asked. He came out of it, went back to work, and never once stopped taking on more. That is who he was on the day he came to a river with his new wife. Deianira was a princess of Calydon, and he had fought a river god in her father's hall to marry her. They were traveling with their son and their household when they reached the Evenus in flood. A centaur named Nessus worked that crossing, carrying travelers over for a fee. Heracles could cross anything, so he paid the centaur to carry his wife and went in himself. He came out on the far bank, turned around and saw the centaur running the other way with her. He had the bow off his shoulder before he finished turning, and he had those arrows. One shot crossed the river and the centaur went down in the shallows on the far side. Deianira came running back through the water while the animal lay bleeding in the reeds. This is where the whole story turns, and it turns on a dying creature being helpful. Nessus called her over and told her he wanted to make amends before he went. He said his blood, mixed from the wound, was the strongest love charm that existed. He told her to collect some and keep it hidden and never let it see the sun. If her husband ever wanted another woman, she was to soak a garment in it and send it to him. She would have him back the same day, and he would never look at anyone else again. Deianira knelt in the reeds and filled a small bronze jar while the centaur watched her do it. Then she wrapped the jar in cloth, put it at the bottom of a chest, and said nothing. Sophocles has her keep that secret for the entire length of their marriage. Understand what she is at this point, because the play depends on it completely. She is not a witch, not a schemer, and not a woman with a grievance she is nursing. She is a wife in a house that her husband visits between campaigns for 20 years. He is away for seasons at a time, and messengers bring news of him from other countries. She raises their children in Trachis and manages a household built around a permanent absence. Then a war ends in Ocalia, and a column of prisoners arrives at her gate. Among them is a young woman who does not carry herself like the others in the line. The herald says one thing to the household, and something different to her when pressed. The girl is Iole, and the war was fought over her, and she is coming into the house as a bride. Deianira does not shout, and she does not go to the prisoners, and she does not blame the girl. She says out loud that she cannot be angry at a young woman for being wanted. Then she says the thing that has been sitting under the whole play from the beginning. She has watched her body change for 20 years, while his has not changed at all. He is coming home with a girl the age she was when he first carried her over a river. So she goes to the chest, takes out the jar, and remembers what the centaur told her. She cuts a length of white linen and makes a shirt out of it with her own hands. She soaks it in the dark with a piece of wool and never lets the daylight touch it. She folds it into a box, seals the box, and gives it to a herald named Lycus. Her instructions are exact, and they are the instructions of a woman doing something loving. He is to wear it at the sacrifice, in front of the gods, on the day he gives thanks. She sends it as a homecoming gift, and the sources agree that she sends it out of love. Then she goes back inside and sees the piece of wool she used lying where the sun reaches it. It is crumbled into a fine dust that boils and hisses on the floorboards like acid. She stands over that patch on the floor for a long time, working out what she has done. The blood was not a charm, and the centaur was not sorry, and the arrow that killed him was poisoned. Hydra venom had been in his body since the river, and it had been waiting 20 years. She has just sent the strongest man alive a shirt soaked in the thing that killed the Hydra. Messengers are already on the road, and the distance to the altar is a full day. On a headland in Euboea, an ox is on the ground, and the fire is high on the stone. Heracles opens a box a herald has brought him and lifts out a clean, white shirt. He puts it on over his shoulders in front of the priests and turns back to the altar. Heat from the fire reaches the cloth, and the cloth begins to tighten against his back. Hydra venom does not burn like fire at first, and it does not announce itself at all. The heat from the altar opens the cloth, the poison wakes, and the shirt draws in against him. He reaches back to pull at the shoulder, stops, and the priests turn their faces away. Priests around the stone see the strongest man in the world turn and stagger into the fire. The ox on the altar goes into the ashes, and the whole offering scatters across the rock. Men who had come to watch a sacrifice run for the tree line and do not look back. One shout comes off that headland and carries down to the ships in the bay below. Sailors on the water stop working and stand at the rails listening to a sound they cannot place. The one thing every version agrees on is that the cloth would not come off him. He had killed the Hydra half a lifetime earlier and never once thought about it again. That blood had been waiting in a sealed jar at the bottom of a wooden chest for years. Lycus the herald is still standing there, holding the empty box, explaining who sent it. One tradition says Heracles took hold of him and threw him off the headland into the sea. Sailors on that coast later pointed at a white rock offshore and gave it the herald's name. Nothing in that moment belongs to the man who cleaned the world of monsters. In Trachis, the messengers arrive at the house and tell the household what happened on the cliff. Deianira listens to the whole report, standing in the middle of her own hall. Her son comes in behind the messengers and says out loud that his mother has killed his father. She does not answer him, does not defend herself, and does not explain the centaur. Sophocles gives her no speech at all, and this is the most famous silence in his work. She turns, walks past the loom and the beds and the rooms she has kept for 20 years. The doors close behind her, and the household loses her that afternoon without another word. Her son learns the truth about the jar an hour too late to say anything to her. He goes down to the coast and finds his father on a stretcher, surrounded by frightened men. Then the dying man asks him for two things, and both requests are impossible. The first is that his son take Iole as his own wife when this is finished. The second is that he be carried up Mount Oeta and burned alive on a pyre. Understand why he asks for fire, because it is not despair and it is not theater. An oracle had told him years before that no living man would ever kill him. It said his killer would be someone already dead, and he had laughed at that. Now he is lying under a shirt soaked by a centaur he shot in a river long ago. He works out the riddle on the stretcher and stops fighting the same minute he solves it. A man who understands the mechanism of his own death wants control over the last part. So they carry him up the mountain, and the household builds a pyre out of oak and pine. He climbs onto it himself, lies down on the wood, and puts the lion skin under his head. Then he asks the men standing around the pyre to bring a torch and light it. His son refuses immediately and says he will not put fire to his own father. His companions refuse next, one after another, and none of them will hold the torch. They had followed him through every country in the world, and none of them can do this. 60 years of loyalty stop at the edge of that pile of wood on the mountain. One man steps forward, a young archer named Philoctetes, who has said nothing until now. He agrees to light it, and he asks for the bow and the arrows in exchange. Heracles gives him both, and the deal is the last transaction of his mortal life. Then Philoctetes carries the torch around the base and puts it into the dry wood. Everyone else on that mountain turns their back or walks down the path in silence. Flame goes up through the frame of the pyre, while thunder starts somewhere above the smoke. Cloud comes down over the summit, and the fire and the storm meet in the middle. Men on the slope hear the mountain crack open and see the light go white through the trees. When the smoke clears, there is a burned frame, a bed of ash, and no body in it. There is nothing to bury on that mountain, and there is nothing to carry home. Zeus took his son off the pyre and brought him up to the table on Olympus. Hera stopped hating him, and he married her daughter, and the quarrel of his whole life closed. Greeks built him temples across the mainland and the islands and sacrificed to him as a god. He is the only mortal in these stories who was worshipped in both ways at once. Some cities gave him hero offerings for the man, and other cities gave him god offerings. So the promise from the first minute of this video has now paid out completely. The mortal the gods loved most died worse than every other name in this countdown. He also became the only one they took, and to a Greek, that was a fair exchange. 9 hours of pain bought a permanent seat at the table, and the trade made sense to them. That is the part worth sitting with, because it explains the whole system these people believed in. Their gods did not spare the ones they loved, and they did not consider that a contradiction. Being loved by them was a career, and the pension arrived after the fire. Now look at the 9 graves this list has produced. A small shrine stands beside the road between Mycenae and Argos, with offerings on the step. A mound rises on a headland above Troy, where sailors could see it from open water. A temple stands in the middle of Athens, holding bones a general dug out of an island. A body sails away from Ithaca to a witch's island with a wife and 2 sons aboard. A rotten hull lies on a beach at Corinth, with nothing marked anywhere near it. A tomb sits inside the walls at Mycenae, under a household that kept killing for generations. A grave holds a man on the Trojan shore that two kings tried to forbid. A plain of dry grass in Asia Minor holds nothing and has never held anything. A bed of gray ash sits on a mountain in Thessaly with no bones in it at all. Every one of those men beat the monster he was famous for beating. Not one of them survived what came after the monster was finished. A wife, a son, a friend, a host, a vote, a shirt, a beam, a fly, a crowd. The list of things that killed the greatest heroes of Greece is a list of ordinary things. Their myths were never warnings about monsters, because monsters were the solvable part. They were warnings about the afternoon when the shouting stops and the road home starts. Greeks told these stories for 1,000 years and never once fixed the endings. They could have written Perseus a war, or given Bellerophon a bolt, or let Ajax win the vote. They kept it exactly as it was because they thought the second half was the true part. So the question they leave in your hands is the one they never answered on stage. All 9 of these men killed the thing that was supposed to kill them. Not a single one of them survived being the man who did it. An empty stone pedestal stands in a roofless temple with the columns broken around it. Ivy has come up through the floor and taken the base and started up the sides. Whoever stood there is gone, and the plants do not know the difference at all.